let me tell you that Vladimir Milov is simply one of the guys you listen to on Russia's political economy. And there's not, let's be honest here, but there's not that many. Okay, he's not the only one, but there's not many. And you really listen to Vladimir, I assure you. In his 20s, to make you feel inadequate, he was briefly a deputy energy minister in Russia, followed by a more lucrative, I presume, spell in his own consultancy. And these days, he is a political and economic advisor to Alexei Navalny's campaign. So good choice, Alexei Navalny. Now, just before we hand over to Vladimir, I'll just go over a couple of admin things. You're probably conversant with it by now, but we've chosen this meeting format because we like to make it feel as normal as possible. So it's great that we can see most of you. Don't worry if you can't, it's not obligatory. You're muted at the moment, but we will unmute you for the Q&A discussion session. If you wish to ask a question in person, that's fine. Just raise your hand electronically in the participants tab. If you just want to write it out, I'm happy to narrate it for you for Vladimir's benefit and everybody else's. Any technical difficulties, please write a personal message through the chat to my colleague Quinn Scribner, who's on your screen as well, waving right there. So that is basically it, only to say that we're on the record today, and we'll probably, I mean, let's see how it goes, but we'll probably put a recording of this session up on the website. Right, I would just say by way of introduction that it does seem to me that when talking about Russia's economy and its political economy, that as always, the political scientists seem split. Some believe Russia will come through this unscathed, relatively unscathed anyway, in spite of it all. Others think it'll sink Russia, and then there's this medium in between where Russia will survive, of course, but in a relatively unrecognizable format, certainly with all of its plans in tatters. So here to help us through these scenarios is Vladimir. Vladimir is an old friend of the program. He's been to Chatham House multiple times. In fact, when I was asked to select some Russians for the redesigned Chatham House, I could obviously it wasn't entirely easy to find some Russians whose portraits I put on the Chatham House wall, but Vladimir's was one of just two I chose to go up on the wall in Chatham House, and I'm very grateful because he's a man I respect enormously. Vladimir, welcome, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and many thanks for having me. It's really a privilege. I'm speaking from my Moscow home, and yes, this is the first day when lockdown has been fully lifted. There are some things still banned, like mass anti-Putin rallies, but we can go freely and not ask for a permission anymore anywhere we want. I understand. I'll talk, if you like, I'll talk more about this pandemic situation in the Q&A session, but there was a lot of information that the Moscow city administration was not in favor of quick lifting of the lockdown because the virus situation is not really looking too good, but they were sort of forced to do it by the Kremlin because they want to have a smooth and relaxed atmosphere. People are tired of lockdown, and there is this 1st of July constitutional voting coming, so they want everybody to be happy. And not irritated anymore by sitting at home for 3 straight months. So they forced Sobyanin to lift it. Now, to the economy, what I'm going to do, because nobody knows what's going to happen, there are too many variables. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out a number of different underlying factors and variables which might produce different scenarios, basically for you to judge, pick your own, what scenario you consider the most realistic. But I would like you to pay attention to a few important things. First, there was this recent publication by SMAC, the Center for Macroeconomic Forecasting, Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting. This is actually a center which advised the top government officials for about 3 decades now. And it was created, in fact, by Andrei Belarus, who is former Putin's economic advisor and currently the first deputy prime minister. Their head of research team, whose name appears as the chairperson of all the recent analysis, is Belarus's brother, Dmitry. So I strongly advise, this is actually a very important read for all of you who want to understand the government's thinking. Plus, I disagree with these guys on some major policy analysis factors, but they're really good at counting the numbers. So they produce like an honest count. They don't go fishing with numbers, with statistics and so on. And what is pretty important is that they produced three major scenarios for Russia for 2020 and a couple of years beyond. And essentially their basic case scenario is far worse than the government has been recently announcing, because government says that we're going to see, like different officials say, from 4 to 6% GDP decline this year. Now, the SMART forecast uses 4 to 4.5% decline GDP contraction only in an optimistic scenario. Their base case scenario is 8.2. And they have also a pessimistic scenario, which is minus 11. So clearly, because we're talking about folks who are really very close to government, essentially this is government's main lab when it comes down to analyzing macroeconomic trends and making forecasts. So what we see right now is a very serious deterioration of the forecast in the coming, in the past month and a half, let's say so, because they coming to a realization of the fact that recovery is not going to be as smooth as they thought initially. What are the variables in this equation? First, of course, and they officially mention it, so because these are folks very close to government, you might as well say that this is what they think in the corridors of power right now. They openly talk in the base case scenario about the reintroduction of lockdowns further down the road, which will damage mainly gross regional products of big and medium-sized cities. So they openly talk about it as like, you know, like something which is already understood is going to definitely happen. So what we see right now is this swift reopening of Russia is, I assume it's largely connected with Putin's desire to hold the constitutional referendum at any cost. But they realize that the pandemic is pretty serious, so they will have to reintroduce lockdowns further down the road, and this will obviously have a negative economic effect. Now, the one big unknown is how the economy will behave after the restrictions are eased. Of course, they also assess a number of external factors like the price of oil and stuff, which and how the global economy behaves. I really won't go into that because this is sort of beyond our control. But I think the next thing is that here's where we disagree a lot with government folks. They believe that once the lockdowns are lifted, the economy will, like, you know, in the spring when snow melts, the grass and the leaves on the trees, they basically start to grow by themselves. So actually, this is what they think is going to happen by definition with the economy, only with the easing of lockdowns. I think that this thinking is deeply flawed. This is not going to be the case for two major reasons. First, the business climate, the business entrepreneurial activity in the country is very severely depressed. I advise you also to take a look, as again, I'm referring to pretty official papers and documents, the annual report to the president by Boris Titov, the presidential special envoy on protecting business and investment. He produces this annual report about the problems with the business climate in Russia. So actually, they did the survey with a lot of entrepreneurs and experts on these major issues in business climate, like independence of judiciary and tyranny of all these control authorities and siloviki and so on, and legal protection of investment and businesses and so on. So there's been a lot of publications about that. You can read it. I also advise you to go through these numbers because they are shocking. Like 75% of entrepreneurs surveyed answered that doing business in Russia is completely unsafe. There is no legal protection. You cannot seek protection in courts because they're not independent. and so on and on and on. What is important is that we all know this stuff, but they did the same survey 2 years ago, and it was like 50-50, which had quickly switched to 70-30 now, in favor of the opinion that doing business in Russia is unsafe. What I hear, because I host a major economic YouTube program on the Alexei Navalny YouTube channel, so I do get a lot of feedback from entrepreneurs, and it's been on for more than 3 years now, so I can see certain dynamics. I haven't seen anything like that in terms of reports that of shutdowns and complete closures of business as I see today. There's this official Russian entrepreneurs union of small businesses called Opora России. They have estimated that about 1 million out of 6 million small businesses in Russia, by August, about 1 million will be shut down completely forever. And I think this is a pretty realistic estimate. Maybe, not even optimistic. I think let's talk about this figure, about like 1 million businesses being shut down in just like 3 months. That's a fairly realistic, completely honest estimate. So these businesses will not about to restart. After lockdown is eased, many people in the government and optimistic analysts are hoping that they will just come back. No. There's what we're experiencing right now is sort of a major extinction event, which is happening not only because of the crisis and quarantine and pandemic and so on, but because this is like a moment of truth. People have been preparing, thinking about potential closure for years, but they sort of tried to hold on until this event occurred. Now, the second problem is that Russians did not really receive, a lot of Russians have lost jobs and income. You have a pretty mild official figures like plus 800,000 new unemployed in April, as reported by Rosstat. This is not too much, but people just simply either do not apply or cannot get registered. So there are independent estimates like this. There's this web portal called superjob.ru, which is the biggest Russian online website that is handling job applications. Its founder, Alexei Zakharov, estimates that the real number of new unemployed because of this crisis is 10 million, which I think is the much more realistic estimate. So 10 million people sitting for like 3 months without any major income. Recently, government reported that only less than 500,000 Russians have been receiving this maximum unemployment benefit of 12,000 rubles, as Putin's promised, which is less than $200 a month. Putin has promised that to everyone who lost their job since March, but the report is only 450,000 has been actually receiving it. So what I'm saying is that the financial safety pillow has been eroded for many Russians. They will not have actual money to spend after the quarantine is eased. And there is another important factor where I disagree also with government thinking and with smart forecast is they believe that the so-called national projects, you know what I'm talking about, I think that there's no need to clarify, they will actually produce a lot of growth. So they keep saying repeatedly that we just need to wait before all this heavy infrastructure spending by the government will produce growth. Here is like this is where we totally disagree, because Russia has been flirting with the idea that massive state investment in some major projects will produce a lot of economic growth. We've been flirting with this idea for like 15 years now. We saw massive spending on all this road and bridge stuff. What we didn't see is growth. It didn't produce any. And actually, the question is why there is still no explanation from no government official as to why would national projects generate growth this time. Actually, I would again refer to the major speech that was given by Russian central banker Elvira Nabiullina about a year ago, at the International Financial Forum in Moscow, she was very critical of this thinking, and she said, government does not create growth. Government with its spending can only create conditions for growth, but growth is created by business. So we need to stimulate business activity. We're coming back to square one here, right? But like Belarus and their folks, they have this big idea that, oh, now we're gonna spend a lot of money on this concrete and steel stuff, build some roads and so on. Okay, I'm not saying that roads are totally unhelpful, but the key factor for me is business activity, entrepreneurial activity. This is right, quoting the Pulp Fiction movie, you know, it's as dead as dead, you know. So it's, again, read the report by Boris Titov about the current business climate. And you can see that they have been repeatedly over years forecasting, for instance, that the capital flight would somehow at some point change, and we're gonna be in a positive green territory, and capital will be coming back to Russia. This is just not happening. Capital is still fleeing, which is again another reflection of the current business climate in Russia. So just to summarize all this stuff, I don't see any major factors which can bring Russia back to significant economic growth after all this pandemic is over. Plus, importantly, already even the government folks realize and publicly recognize that this is far from over. There will be new lockdowns because the situation with pandemic is pretty bad. But okay, at some point it will end. So what then? The only hope, the only thread on which the government thinking is hanging right now is the so-called national projects. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the Mishustin plan on economic recovery. He announced a 7 trillion plan to help the economy recover in 2020, 2021. I have to say only 5 trillion of that is budget money, which is not a lot because break down by 2 years, this is 2.5 a year, which means about 2 to 3% of Russian GDP a year, which is not a lot of stimulus, really. And most of it, majority of it, comes in terms of deferred tax liabilities. People are allowed to pay taxes later, but still pay them, but not in terms of real cash being injected in the economy. So the plan is not helpful. And obviously, if you break it down by figures, the champion of spending are still these big infrastructure projects. Lots of concrete, lots of steel, lots of money to Rotenberg, Shuvalov, and all these folks that we now know and love. So essentially, again, I don't see entrepreneurial activity, which is pretty depressed right now, really restoring to the pre-crisis levels after the lockdown is lifted some point in the future. I see that the government frankly recognizes that by focusing instead on spending through national projects, but they just do not seem to work. Again, I can talk for hours about the reasons why national projects don't work, but we do have, let's stop at the point that we do have a lot of empirical evidence. And there's this simple formula, the Nabiulina formula, which she brilliantly explained, that national projects are only infrastructure, which is set to help entrepreneurial activity to create growth on this basis, right? But if you don't have sufficient entrepreneurial activity, nothing's going to happen, right? So again, I do not buy this idea that we're going to experience fast recovery after all this smoke of the quarantine is gone. There are no drivers for that. Business climate is disastrous. Capital is fleeing. Russia is not fit for investment at this moment. National projects alone, okay, they might do some useful stuff, but they alone cannot create anything. So hopes for recovery, I think, are overly optimistic. But what they are really hoping on, I also advise you to watch. This is very important. There's been a new appointment in the central bank recently. They appointed Kirill Trimasov, very famous market analyst, I think one of the best Russian macroeconomists, to the position of the new head of Department of Monetary Policy in central bank in just recent couple of weeks. before his appointment, Trimasov produced the last video when he already knew that he was going to take the central bank position. I advise you to watch, because he actually explains how Russia will look after the crisis, which reflects a lot their thinking, their worldview. He says, the crisis will be over sooner or later, and we'll get out of it with low government debt and still some financial reserves remaining and a good macro. So we will be attractive for international investment, and we will be positioned for further growth, and we will be best of emerging markets in terms of that. I think they also recognize that with this business climate, we won't see much private investment. So what they're essentially talking about is foreign investors buying government bonds, allowing government to spend more on national projects. So that's the perpetual engine, right? Again, they're betting big. The national project so far is their only major hope for the future, which again, I completely disagree with the notion that they will ever produce any meaningful growth. Instead, the government and a lot of macroeconomists from the macroeconomic community, they agree that with the government that yes, national projects will somehow work. I don't. So here's the split, right? I think you can look at this issue further and make your own judgments, but this is actually the main idea at the moment. We have low government debt, so we can borrow more and we can spend more on building these roads, bridges, whatever, which will generate a lot of growth. Kind of reminds me of the late Soviet era. Gorbachev, ускорение, spending a lot of currency on buying manufacturing equipment in the West, which some of it is still lying somewhere at the factories unpacked after all this 30 plus years. So, I mean, let's see how it goes, but we don't see much other ideas on the side of the government except spending on national projects. And I don't see any real desire to address this basic problem of business climate and economic activity, which is pretty much depressed by all this bureaucratic tyranny, which I think is the major problem. I'll stop here. We'll be happy to take a lot of questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Vladimir. That is a terrific, albeit slightly depressing analysis where there's not much of a way out, and what you seem to have said is that the Russian government is putting all of its eggs in one basket, whereby the Demosov plan, if you like, or the Titov plan. I think what you seem to be telling us is that the statists are winning over. We've always had this discussion about the Russian economy as, who are people listening to? Are they listening to the Grefs and, frankly, you yourself and the Guryevs of this world, or are they listening to the Titovs and the Belarusovs? What you said is that Nabiulina, for example, is not being listened to. Is what I can say, and so they've decided they're going in that direction. And you did. I was about to ask you. Why are they going in this direction? Why have they taken this particular road? Why do they believe that investment is going to flood in when the conditions seem so unripe for it? Why do they believe that it's all about roads and steel and concrete? They must. I don't find it hard to believe because I believe you implicitly, but I find it curious as to how they can put all of their eggs in one basket, Vladimir, when a more modern economist's approach would suggest that there is so much more to be done econometrically. Why is this statist approach, which we've seen for a long time, is still continuing? I'd just like a little bit more on the why.
Yeah. Listen, I think it's a merger of different factors. Of course, there's this major underlying factor of corruption and interest, because they need this money, because they make a lot of money out of this spending on national projects. But that's not all. I think Putin always been statist in his worldview. Putin never believed in such things as private investment, private initiative, market forces, competition. He thinks that this is all crap, right? This is all chaos. It needs to be managed, right? So he's in a lot of ways, he's a control freak when it comes to strategic issues of economic development and so on. But I think why now they are only focused on this direction is that the first issue is that Russian economic policy has been pretty much like everything else. It's been increasingly totally dependent on Putin's thinking. So like 10 years ago, it was a competition, not to mention like 15 or 20 years ago, but 10 years ago, still it was like a competition of different worldviews inside the government. Like not anymore. Again, by the minute, even as we move further, Putin and what he personally thinks becomes increasingly dominating. So there's this only a competition who puts a thought in Putin's mind, right? So when I referred to Nabiullina's speech, she was addressing himself and trying to say that, look, national projects are good, but they're not enough. And the second thing is, I think Putin had completely lost faith in private business after this several consecutive crises, 2008, 2014, and what we see right now. I think he completely lost faith in private business because the business that we have in Russia, the oligarchy, I mean, not really market forces type, has been essentially lining up for state support over all this like 12 years. We have in September, we have a 12-year anniversary since a major decline began, after which Russia didn't see, like they say in movies, it was the last time Titanic ever saw daylight, right? It was September 08. Since then, we are at the same level, essentially. We didn't have any growth. So he saw businesses lining up for state support. So he thinks of himself like, look, I'm still the champion of all these things. When they're in trouble, they come to me for state money. So I think he doesn't have faith in this business activity anymore, which is why the only faith he has in this major spending by the government, which can only fix it because all these private entrepreneurs are not really worthy. They can't produce anything, right? And of course, for them to admit that they are doing something wrong by damaging the business climate through the actions of like FSB, police, prosecutor's office, all these multiple regulators, no, of course not. How can they be wrong? I mean, like Putin, when he answered the Calvi question, which I think was a game changer. Calvi case and Sergei Petrov and Rolf case were why this desperation of the business reflected in Titov's survey had jumped so much in 2 years. Because of these high-profile cases, loyal people being persecuted for just like stuff that should be resolved through civil law, period. And Putin said, like when he was asked the Calvi question, he said, but the FSB got a lot of material, which is solid, right? So this is why Calvi is going to sit. He directly said that, right? So this is, it all comes to Putin, his worldview, which I think had evolved in the past decade so that he completely lost faith in market forces and only believes that the state should intervene and spend to produce growth. It comes from him.
It's very interesting, Vladimir, because it's funny you should say that, and you should end on that note, because I've just been reading a short piece by a colleague of mine, also in Moscow, Yekaterina Shulman, and she's just been telling me that we mustn't think it's all about Putin, and that Putin isn't making the decisions. It's not manual control. And that it's about institutions and bureaucracies. And I've slightly been pushing back on it, saying up to a point, but surely when it comes to the most important decisions of a strategic direction, then it is about him. Obviously, he's not making every single decision. And yet, so it's interesting. I don't think Yekaterina's on this call, unfortunately, because I would have brought her in right now to take that on. But it's just a different view, and I must keep on that particular line of conversation, because you are very much saying, as far as I just read you, that in fact that Putin is ultimately responsible, not just because he's the commander-in-chief, but because he is setting the strategic direction, and he ultimately, sets his stall out with the statists rather than the market economists. More than enough from me. I've got a couple of questions in already. As I said, ladies and gents, either put it on the chat, as I see that a couple of you have, or raise your electronic hand through the participants tab. In the meantime, I'm going to go to Richard Wright, who is a former EU ambassador in Moscow. And Richard writes, when Putin came to power, On the back of high oil revenues, he ensured pensions were paid, teacher salaries as well, etc. In the light of the sharp GDP decline forecast, are public sector pensions and salaries in real terms under serious threat, thereby weakening Putin's popularity? Thanks.
Well, they're not under serious threat, but we have this perpetual problem. With any crisis, ruble devalues, and we still, consumer market depends a lot on imports. Maybe not on finished products, but on a lot of intermediary goods and so on, which are further sold in the consumer market. So prices continue to grow. Any devaluation of ruble hits consumer prices, which means that the budget salaries and pensions are being devalued a lot. In some sectors, this is a catastrophic scale, like army, for instance. Salaries in the Russian military have actually not been indexed since 2012 properly. They are being slightly indexed somehow, but you can see that, for instance, there was an interesting paper by the Defense Committee of the State Duma when the state budget for 2020 was considered. They keep writing this stuff every year during the budget process, but they say that the salaries in the military are under-indexed by about 50%. So what I'm saying is that the consuming purchasing power of the folks who work in the military had shrunk by 50% in the past 8 years, right? So that's the issue. The salaries and the pensions are going, but the purchasing power is lost. For instance, I have to say that this recent devaluation had eroded the effect of increased pensions, because they 2 years ago, when they announced pension reform, they promised that pensions would grow by 1,000 rubles every year. They slightly tricked people. They're growing by about 800 rubles, not really 1,000, but still, that's an indexation, right? But in dollar terms, they moved nowhere. The average pension in 2018 was $212. It's $215 now. So it's pretty much the same, which means, they do pay a lot of salaries and pensions from state money, but the crisis and devaluation of ruble kills all of that. By the way, Belarus forecast says that in a basic case scenario, we might see 90 and even 100 rubles per dollar by the end of the year, which means consumer purchasing power is going to be further hit. So this is actually eroding all this spending on salaries and pensions that budget, yes, still provides.
Exactly. Understood. Ladies, I don't think I see any electronically raised hands. I'd love to bring you in, yourselves, if I may. But in the meantime, I'll read out another question from Alex Folks, who's an election observer for the OSCE in ODIHR. I'll read it out. It's slightly amusing, but I'll read it out because I can't summarize it. But it says, when Tito stood for a presidency 2 years ago, his economic message seemed to be all about the new technologies. I remember him boring his audience to death about how blockchain was going to be the future of the Russian economy. I hope you didn't mind me reading that out, Alex. Why has he changed his tune so completely about technologies? Here's the first question. And actually, Alex, whilst I'm here, Alex also asked a separate question about the reserves. Everyone talks about the reserves. Why aren't they being run down? Obviously, we've heard about it. It's for a second wave. They're keeping them in stall. It's for the investment you were talking about. So yeah, just a quick note on the reserves as well, please.
Yeah, so a quick note on Titov as well. I mean, don't take seriously anything he said during a presidential campaign, because this was all like a stage spectacle. I mean, it was not really worth discussing. But Titov does produce a really very, very good annual report on the state of affairs on business climate. A lot of data, a lot of surveys, a lot of statistics on criminal persecution and regulatory pressure on entrepreneurs. So his team is brilliant on that. I mean, I do not completely support him politically, but the work he is doing is extremely important. Please read it. If you want to understand business climate in Russia, just read that stuff. All the data is there. Yeah. Now, on reserves, I think the current strategy is, again, Trimasov had explained this in a video, his last pre-central bank video message that he posted online, which I strongly advise you to watch. They want to outlive this crisis still having some reserves, which is why they're not providing really massive stimulus to the economy, because they think it's better to have the reserves when the crisis is over, than to spend them trying to help economy pass through difficult times and recover, right? They believe that essentially reserves is their major value. Imagine all these people, Putin, Nabiullin, Siluanov, without reserves now, zero financial reserves of the government. What these folks going to be really worth? So that's their major political and administrative and economic policy currency, right? Without reserves, they're next to nothing. So, yeah. So this is why they are aimed to keep them. Siluanov, I don't know, maybe this thinking evolves over time, but recently he said that they plan to spend some, so they're going to have 7 trillion in the National Wealth Fund by the end of the year. We currently have 12. And they say that National Wealth Fund won't be spent until 2024, which means that they still want to run up with this water in their hands until they reach the safe zone. So again, reserves is a major instrument of Russian economic thinking and policy. They believe that it makes them attractive, that they have the reserves, which is why they're going to risk the economy and not spend the reserves on stimulus and recovery, but they prefer to outweigh the crisis still having them, so they look attractive to the international macroeconomic and investment community.
Yeah, it seems like reserves aren't really a rainy day fund, because if ever there was a rainy day, this it's now. So instead, they're there for an entirely different purpose other than a rainy day fund in a way.
Yeah.
Understood.
So we have a thunderstorm day, but they still keep it. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right, a couple of people have raised their electronic hand. I'll turn first to Oksana Antonienko, who most of you know, but is a fellow at the Kennan Institute. Oksana, we'll unmute you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Vladimir. Very interesting presentation. Can you maybe say a few words of what do you think should have been the best strategy of getting out of this crisis? Because clearly we all are sort of grappling all over the world with what is actually happening at the moment, and governments even here in the West are looking for strategies of taking sort of equity in quite a lot of manufacturing companies that are on the brink of failing at the moment, or running airlines or even hotels and restaurants. What do you think is the best strategy to pursue in case of Russia, given what you just described, that we have now potentially up to 10 years or certainly 5 years of declining real incomes. We have, heavily state-dominated economy now, probably responsible for about 65–70% of the economy. We have 30% of the entrepreneurial class operating in the gray economy. So with that kind of fundamentals, what do you think should be, the priority steps, if Mr. Navalny, for example, would have been in power compared to what the government is doing?
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. This question really breaks down into two. First, how do we pass through this particular crisis? And second, what do we do after? Because, there's a really big split. There's a huge split. We are on different planets, Navalny team and Putin team, in terms of, okay, at some point economy might recover, so what we do next? Now, if this state model continues, such as it is, there is no hope. There's absolutely no future, because they're going to be taxing people more to spend more money on infrastructure projects, which will not produce growth. Economy is going to become further monopolized. Business climate will continue to further deteriorate. This is a road to nowhere. So we need to demonopolize, achieve a big state exit from the economy. We need to really create a favorable business climate and encourage medium and small size business development in the first place. We need to, and I repeat, like George Bush, the senior, said, read my lips, we need massive direct foreign investment in this country, which is something Putin is opposed to fundamentally. And foreign direct investment has been on a decline recently. 75% of Russian foreign direct investment are offshore money, which are Russian money coming back. So this is about the after part of the question. What do we do after this crisis? But right now, what we need to do, and this is exactly, Navalny had proposed a plan called 5 Steps for Russia, which is resembling a lot what the governments in Europe and the United States are doing. This is massive government stimulus, primarily directly to the population and the small and medium-sized businesses to prevent two things which I have been talking about. First, the mass extinction of small entrepreneurship, which will not reopen. What we need to do is spend massively to prevent them from shutting down, to keep them running. And this is what Putin is really not doing. And second, to prevent erosion of savings of the population, because this will hurt their purchasing power when we come back after the lockdown. Government is counting on people spending at the pre-crisis levels, but they won't have enough money to spend at the pre-crisis levels. So we need to give them direct financial support. So the major part, the biggest part of Navalny's plan are direct financial assistance to the Russian population, more or less like what the US Treasury is doing, economic impact payments and so on. So we have a huge debate on this, but this is our plan because we think that one important issue, which I've been talking about in the beginning of my presentation, is when the economy will begin to recover, a lot of Russian citizens, a lot of small businesses will not have the capacity to restart the economic activity at the pre-crisis levels. So we need to prevent that. And this totally differs from Putin's thinking, from the government's thinking, because they, again, read their reports and analysis. They think that the economic activity will just restart by itself, like grass growing in spring, right? It won't, because there's a very severe financial blow on the purchasing power and the financial status of the small businesses that is being delivered by the crisis right now. We need to massively help them, and Putin's government is helping population and small businesses totally insufficiently. So that's the difference in the current view on what to do. But there's this big question about what to do next after we get out of the woods, and just trying to explain also that.
Thanks, Vladimir. It's interesting. I have another colleague, actually, also not on this call, Richard Connolly, who tells me that he doesn't believe that SMEs are especially important to the Russian economy. I don't know if you agree about it or not, but I suppose your point is that they damn well should be.
Yeah. No, this is a classic macro view, and also I think a big explanation why Putin does not help small businesses, because they really make not a big contribution to the GDP. That's true. Yeah. But it's totally opposite if you look at their contribution to jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, the goddamn extractive industries only give less than 2 million jobs in Russia. Now, small and medium-sized businesses give about 15 million jobs. So there, if you break down by industry, essentially small and medium-sized business-associated industries are biggest job creators. Trade and services are biggest job creators. They give ordinary Russians money. So much money as extractive industries cannot give them, because they export the oil and keep the income in state reserves, right? So how do people in this economic system, how do people earn the money? By trying to do something, you know. So that's, I mean, 15 million jobs, biggest job creators, that's a lot of importance for the Russian economy. It's actually total Russian workforce is like 75 million. So you can calculate yourself for how big a chunk of that is small and medium-sized business. So that's extremely important. That's extremely important. And again, we here face this split between the macroeconomic thinking that, I mean, Russians might as well die out, but we have a good macroeconomic conditions. So that's, as long as it's so, we're fine, right?
Sure.
But we're not looking at this way. We're looking at the economy as a driver for increased well-being of our citizens, opposite to Putin, right? So if we count the well-being part, small and medium-sized business are extremely important.
Great, understood. Right, we've got, well, we're halfway in, 45 minutes left. I've got 7 or 8 questions, so we're absolutely fine. I'll go to James Bergeron. I'll read his question out. James is at NATO Maritime Command. He says, do the blue-collar workers and the middle managers of heavy infrastructure industries constitute a core base of political support for Putin that he is trying to prop up? Or is the desire to keep spending within tight groups of sectoral oligarchs, if you like, the driving factor?
Look, I think in terms of core base of support for Putin, I think there's a different breakdown. You shouldn't break it down by industries. We have a lot of Navalny supporters in the heavy, defense industries and state companies and so on. And many people who work there are donating us money, for instance. But I think the breakdown clearly goes by age factor. And also it's in a classic political geography of Western countries. It's cities versus villages, and big and medium-sized cities versus smaller cities. So the further you move from big cities, the less support you have for the opposition, the more support for Putin. That's a pretty clear political analysis picture. So Putin's thinking is influenced by one thing. He will reconsider his policy once there's a severe political pressure, bottom-up pressure from the society on him. You saw that he changed his mind several times during this past months, and he announced, after initially hesitating, he announced more and more packages. Some of the stuff is pretty good, like 10,000 rubles payment for every family with a child. That's a pretty good move, but he only announced it like a couple of months after hesitation, right? Or he even stolen some piece from Navalny's economic program, because nobody except Navalny and myself have been talking about lowering the payroll tax from 30 to 15%. That's a direct quote from Navalny presidential program. Nobody else has been talking that. Now Putin announced that measure, but only for small and medium-sized businesses who pay salaries lower over the minimum wage, right? But that's still a good move. So he announced bits and pieces of really good moves, but only after he probably saw some surveys that his popularity is falling, so he needs to do something to kind of calm the people down. So he might reconsider his policies once society speaks up. That's the major game changer, which is to occur further.
Wow. Vladimir Putin changing his policies. I never thought I'd hear it from your mouth. Interesting. Right, I'm going to turn to another colleague of mine, actually, and I'm proud to say, a new colleague, Yekaterina Olinikova, has just joined my team at Chatham House on a part-time basis. Yekaterina, we'll unmute you.
Thank you. Well, firstly, Vladimir, I'd like to thank you so much for this talk. It was really fascinating. My question is about, you've mentioned this idea that the government is expecting foreign investment to go up after this crisis. And to me, I think the problem with that is that the main obstacles to foreign investment are political and not economic in nature. It's the sanctions, it's the lack of trust in the business climate and the regime in Russia by foreign investors. And I wonder, why is it that the government is kind of overlooking that? Do you think they're being disingenuous when they say that they believe that investment will go up, or are they just overlooking political factors? Or maybe do they believe that the political factors are going to change after the crisis as well? Do they believe that maybe sanctions will be lifted? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ekaterina.
Thank you very much. And I need to clarify my point here, because, again, I was not talking about this general foreign investment flowing into the country, being invested in businesses and so on. I was talking about one specific instrument, Russian government bonds, which are, look, I mean, let's face it, they're extremely attractive for international investors. International investors just love to buy Russian government bonds because this is a pretty secure instrument, because Russian government finances are okay. Country is not okay, population is not okay, but the government finances are okay. So when you invest in government bonds, this is, when I was talking about the government expecting major inflow of investment, I meant specifically this, that because of the good macro, because of the reserves still remaining, because of low government debt, because of the numerical fiscal rule and all that, macro environment they've been building, which is like completely detached from the real economy, but macro really looks good in Russia, right?
Interesting.
So they will attract investors to buy government bonds. They do not expect at all. I mean, none of their papers contain theory that massive foreign investment will inflow into the economy. They actually don't want it because they keep protecting more and more strategic sectors from foreign investment. They're applying new legislation by the day not to allow foreign investors to buy stuff or invest in stuff in Russia. Now we have the media already, we have the IT protected and so on. But I assume retail is going to be on the line pretty soon as a strategic, right? But they want foreign investment in government bonds. So I meant specifically that. And the cynical part about Western capitalist world is that they love it. I mean, they love to buy dictators' bonds, and they do it all the time. And Russian government knows it too, so that's a significant part of their thinking.
That's fascinating. Absolutely, really interesting. A massive difference between the country itself and the macroeconomic situation. Also, raised hand electronically. I'll go to Sir John Scarlett, please. Sir John needs no introduction. We'll just unmute you.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for all these comments. It's particularly interesting to hear the sort of rational explanation, detailed explanation of the approach and the policy regarding the use or non-use of reserves and where that fits into the broader political calculations. What you haven't really discussed or emphasized in detail is the continuing and projected role of the extractive sector and the oil and gas, of course, in the economy and in the prospects ahead. I mean, I understand your reluctance to get into that, but everything else is so difficult to predict, volatility and so on. But still, it is possible that global prices will go up and prove to be more positive than was thought, let's say, a month ago. What role do you see that playing, particularly if it might allow the authorities to be more relaxed in their approach to expenditure from reserves? Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the oil and gas, yeah, that's really, I try to explain the general picture that we have now, omitting a bit oil and gas, but okay, it's very good that we're coming back to it now. The major issue is that, okay, even if the oil price rebounds to like $40, $50 per barrel corridor, frankly, I don't see it going any further because we have a major oversupply crisis, fundamental oversupply crisis in the oil and gas markets, largely driven by the US shale. And the US shale is a factor which is very easy to come back. It's an on and off thing. When prices go up, it's very easy to restart drilling and put the volumes back onto the market again, which I think it was pretty clear how it worked during a previous 3-year Russia-OPEC agreement. Russia and OPEC tried to cut more, but it supported the price and more US shale volumes came onto the market, so prices still fell regardless. They fell throughout 2019. They fell the first 2 months of this year, even before all this introduction of lockdowns and so on. So bottom line is, I just don't see major super profits coming in from the oil and gas sector to the extent that we saw in the previous years. And it's important to understand one thing. We have a system of taxation in the Russian oil and gas industry, which is basically very comfortable for the companies, but it is the budget that suffers most from the price collapse. So the companies continue to receive revenue. They have relatively low costs, operational expenses and so on. The big variable is capex, but operational spending is not too big, so they are still competitive at low prices. So they continue to receive revenues, but budget does not receive much of the income from oil and gas exports as it did in the previous years. So that's a big, really, this is connected with the issue of spending of reserves and thinking about their future, right? Because they understand that they need to proceed carefully with spending the reserves because there won't be much of an income from oil and gas further down the road. Even at like, say, $40, $50 per barrel, budget revenues would be pretty low as compared to previous years. So there won't be enough money to actually accumulate new reserves. We just don't see high prices coming in anytime soon. So we need to be significantly above $50 per barrel for a long time to be able to accumulate new reserves. This is really one important factor that adds to their careful approach to spending of the reserves right now, because they just don't see when they will be able to build them again. There's just no super profit, no major revenue from oil and gas as we've seen in the previous years. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, but just so I'm clear on it. So you need, because I understood that the budget can be balanced at $35, but to accumulate new reserves, it needs to be $50 and above. Is that
over
correct?
50? Over 50, significantly over 50.
Yep.
No, James, they can still accumulate some reserves,
right?
But not to the pace and extent they have accumulated national wealth fund in the previous several years after the price collapse of 2014, 2015, right? So they need like 60, 70, so they have a solid inflow of money into the reserves, right? Yeah. At 50, they can't really make it. Major contributions to building the reserves cannot be made.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. I have a couple of questions from my friend Marcin Kaczmarski, who is a noted Russia-China specialist at the University of Glasgow. Fascinating questions. Here goes. To what extent can the post-pandemic stagnation generate more competition for the decreasing resources between the factions within the regime? Very interesting. Okay, so how will this bring out the stresses between the factions in the regime? And second question, to what extent, I said Marcin was a China expert. To what extent can China be the source of foreign direct investment? Simple.
I see.
Hard answer.
First, on the competition between different groups, there will be some. But look, again, just take a look at Mishustin recovery plan. It's very visible that his priority is giving a lot of resources to all these different groups, basically not forgetting any of them, and essentially leaving out the population. So just to give you a couple of figures, there's a breakdown provided. A Russian Forbes had provided a very good chart with a breakdown. 2.5 trillion on big infrastructure projects, 0.7 trillion on social spending, social support of the population. I mean, gives you the idea. It's more than threefold, right? Gives you the idea of the priorities. So the lack of money, deficit of cash, would hurt the population first. Small and medium-sized businesses, they will be left to suffer. There's still enough money for most of the groups. So yes, the rivalry will somehow intensify, but as a matter of fact, they will have sufficient resources to spend on most of these groups for years to come. Unless, I'm not ready to really talk about what happens 2 or 3 years from now, but for that relatively short, medium-term period, I think despite some rivalry, there will be enough for anyone. Now on China. Ironically, you know what happened to Chinese direct investment in the past 5 or 6 years in Russia? They have decreased, going down. Pretty much the same as direct investments from all major countries like G7 and so on, right? So this is associated with two factors. First, despite all these attempts to make it look like China and Russia are best friends geopolitically, there's still a lot of mistrust between the elites of Russia and China. They don't particularly like and trust each other, which is why Russians are protecting its strategic sectors from the Chinese investment. Chinese really wanted very much to establish control over major oil and gas projects in Russia in the first place. They were left out. Government said maximum you can afford is 20-30% in this project or that project. So most of the Chinese hopes for direct investment in the Russian oil and gas upstream, they were dashed by protective behavior of Putin. And Chinese want only strategic sectors, only stuff that they really need to support their economy. Like they want to control the production of mineral resources, which they further consume, right? They don't want to invest just because, right? And this is something interesting because there's been hope in Russia that China will replace the West when we lost access to Western capital markets, for instance, after the sanctions of 2014. We turned our eyes to China saying, look, China is going to replace all that Western investment. It didn't, because Chinese only invest in stuff which they need to support their own economy. And when Russia says, look, but you can go, I mean, we keep the strategic sectors, we don't let you in, but go invest in anywhere else. They say, no, we don't want anywhere else. We want the strategic stuff. So this is actually the point at which Russian-China investment relations are standing at the moment. By the way, Russians, particularly oil and gas companies, also want to penetrate Chinese economy and invest in downstream. And China also protects them from doing that. So despite this public friendship picture, I mean, what we're doing with China is largely wholesale trade at border. Russia is mainly sending its mineral resources and timber to China, and essentially that's it. There is no cross-penetration of investment, not much, and there hasn't been any progress since 2014, despite all these initial hopes and announcements and so on, because both governments are really very protective of their strategic sectors.
Yeah, and it would seem that China is, in spite of the COVID crisis, is probably getting more confident in what it can do as well, and the success of the economic success of its relations with Russia, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Probably on a related note, I'll turn to Peter Oppenheimer, who's raised his electronic hand. If we can unmute Peter, please, because Peter at University of Warwick is also, like Marcin, a specialist in particular on Russia-China relations. Peter?
My question also is relevant to China, but it concerns more generally the Russians' attitude to the market at home or abroad. You said earlier, Vladimir, that the authorities have lost faith in the idea of free markets. Look, they know their history. Do they not? They must somehow appreciate and they must reconcile their distrust of free markets with the fact that every other country, including not only the Western countries, but China, which is still ruled by the Communist Party, has had to have recourse to market entrepreneurship in order to grow. Russians are not stupid. They must realize that. How do they reconcile a sort of generalized distrust of free markets with the blatant historical evidence that without heavy participation of free markets and entrepreneurship, you don't grow?
Yeah, nice.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question. I wrote a big article about that like a couple of years ago in a profile Russian magazine called Elephants of State Capitalism, where I actually argue, I mean, I wouldn't totally agree with this not stupid part. We need to be careful about that. Because I have this, unlike Ekaterina Shulman, for instance, look, I worked there for 6 years in government during the transition and Putin came to power. I know a lot of people who work there at the same moment, and I talk to a lot of them. And we have this perpetual argument because I say, look, 90% of Chinese economic growth was created by private sector in the past 40 years. They say no. They say no. China is based on the big state companies, big state banks. And so yeah, the private sector is allowed to dwell there somewhere, right? But Chinese economy is driven by the huge state-controlled players in oil and gas and banking sectors and so on. I mean, really, seriously, that's the worldview of all these folks. I'm pretty sure also Putin himself, because they translate a lot of what's going on in the government to me, so I know. And I had this debate, I mean, even at the beginning of Putin's term, 20 years ago, we had this debate going on. A lot of Russian officials have a totally misleading view of China and how it developed, because, again, and this pretty much reflects what they're doing right now. They think, this is, James, also about the question that one of our participants asked about small business not really playing a big role.
Yeah.
That's the thinking, right? Private sector is, I mean, some mice and ants which dwell out there somewhere. I mean, it's not really important. What is important is what the big state players are doing. I think Putin believes that the new economy of the 21st century, unlike this old world capitalist free market competitive economy, new economy should be based on big state giants. And this worked in China, or so they think. This will work in Russia. That's their worldview. Again, here we come to the stupid part. Are they stupid or not? Or do they realize? Well, I'm not so sure, you know, because there's overwhelming evidence to me that Chinese economic growth was based on private initiative, private entrepreneurship, and efficiency of the state sector is fairly questionable, right? But this is not how Putin and his government thinks. They give a lot of credit to Chinese overwhelming growth, to the fact that state played a key role. Again, we can't go on discussing are they stupid or not. You make your own judgment.
I've never thought about doing a seminar on is the Russian leadership stupid or just uncaring. I'll give that
listen,
some
James, that's important. I think what really makes people stupid is their inability to get out of the caged thinking, mythology that had developed in their minds. Go beyond that, look at the real facts. I think that's a principal ability that defines a stupid people from smarter people, right? Make your judgment.
Understood. Yeah, if the evidence changes, then you should change. Even to Peter's original point, if the evidence changes, you change your mind. What do you do? As someone once said. Yeah. Listen, we've got 20 minutes. If you still have the energy, Vladimir, thank you.
Sure.
I will go to my former colleague Katya Glod, who asks a specific question about Belarus. She asks, how will Putin and the Russian government react to Lukashenko's requests for loans under the strained economic circumstances? In other words, are they going to keep on bailing Belarus out or not, or more or less? Over to you.
Now, two things. First, a Russian elite, starting with Putin, but pretty much everybody else, is extremely angry at Lukashenko because we have been bailing them out for, we spend, I think it's the biggest single recipient of Russian economic aid, over $100 billion over the past 15 years. That's a lot of money. We're really not getting anything in return, neither politically nor economically. And Russian elite is pretty angry about that, which is why, you know, when there were rumors, I didn't believe them from the beginning that Putin will stay in power through merger with Belarus. But there is this very objective trend to swallow Belarus, because Russian elite believes that they need to give us something back, right? If we spend a lot of money on them, we're not going to be just bailing them out for nothing anymore, right? We need to get control. So it's the desire to swallow Belarus is fundamental. It's not just about power transition, as we see Putin has a different view on how to proceed in terms of transition, but swallowing Belarus has this major fundamental background in terms of Russian elites desiring to convert this financial aid into more influence and control. So this will continue somehow. But the second part is that we really do not know what's going to happen after the presidential elections, because what we see in Belarus, that's a pretty interesting topic in itself. I think it really looks like a popular revolution, what is happening right now, because we never saw major protest rallies in previous years. They did happen, but only in Minsk mostly. We see a lot of people coming out across the country in about like 30, 40 cities in support of opposition candidates. We see numbers which allow you to say that Lukashenko's support is at negligible levels right now. So we don't know what's going to happen politically. I think Belarus has to pass through a period of major political turbulence in the coming months. I think major decisions in Moscow will be made about how to further proceed with financial aid will only be made after there will be clarity. in terms of stability of Lukashenko regime, because he'll be in a lot of trouble in the coming months, and you'll never know how this thing will end up. I wouldn't speculate. I mean, these are really remarkable things that are unfolding right now in Belarus. Something serious might be further down the road in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. In fact, my colleague Riho Astapenia, who I see is on the Zoom call here, has a piece out on this later this week or early next, in which he asks us to he's not predicting the end of Lukashenko in these elections, but he is saying we really need to imagine a Belarus without Lukashenko. So we'll send it to you, of course, everybody.
Yeah.
Next, from another colleague of mine again. I hope that's not too much of favoritism, but we've got 20 minutes still, and I can fit everybody in, I think. So far, if you ask me a question with 2 minutes to go, I probably can't. Quinton Scribner. He asks if you could talk about the impact of the crisis on Russia's regional economies. Are we likely, to be more specific, he says, to see increased subnational debts, and what challenges will those pose for Russia's long term?
First, yeah, the regions are suffering the most because they really don't have this solid basic income as the federal government does. They receive absolutely nothing from the oil and gas industries. As a matter of fact, the taxation system in Russia is built that way. So first, regions' revenues in the general government budget are about like 35%, not more. And the taxes on which they depend are really, we saw that during the previous crisis, are the most vulnerable to crisis, like the corporate income tax and individual income tax. These are two major pillars of regional budget income. It's pretty obvious that in the crisis, these are the taxes that suffer the most. So really, they are in a tight spot. Government financial aid is absolutely insufficient. It's 200 billion rubles. It's 0.2% of GDP. So, which is actually why, this is one of the reasons why Moscow, for instance, which has, it's a different story, it has a, ample budget, and actually Moscow city budget is more than the Russian defense budget at the moment. That's pretty remarkable. But other regions, this is why they actually have not been introducing stricter lockdowns. I talked to people in most regions, and they say, no, we didn't really have anything like that. Maybe a couple of weeks in April, stores were shut down, but they reopened since, and so on. Things go back as normal, which is why another issue is that we will see a more severe situation with the pandemic in the regions in the coming weeks and months, because there were no lockdowns, and situation is pretty close to catastrophic in terms of the pandemic, but they were forced not to introduce strict lockdowns because they are out of money. They don't have their own income, and they received only a tiny financial aid from the central government. So they're in a pretty dire shape, and they're also responsible for financing most of the social programs, the healthcare, the education. This is all goes through regional budgets, so it might really suffer from all this situation. So I don't know. I mean, we can talk a lot about the political implications of this, but the bottom line is that plunging Putin's popularity, which you saw in many surveys and opinion polls in the recent weeks, it starts in the regions. Because of that situation, the growth of distrust and disillusionment starts in the regions because of this total lack of money and the dire economic situation that was worsened even further by this crisis.
Absolutely, and yet another of my colleagues, it seems like a marketing event for Chatham House, but yet another of my colleagues, Kolya Petrov, has written extensively on this in recent times in his bi-weekly bulletins, and I know you know each other well. Right, not entirely moving on a related question. I'm going to ask one from Natasha Kurt at King's College London, because it's also about the regions, but it's more about something you said previously, because you said previously, Vladimir, that the further away from Moscow you go, the more people support Putin. But, she says, what about, for example, Primorsky Krai, where they appear to support the communists in 2018? So can you say anything about the Far East? Are they still supporting Putin in the Far Eastern regions?
No, I talked about the general picture, so not even Moscow versus regions, because in the regions you do see a lot of opposition, particularly in big cities. I'd say like everything above 200,000 residents is more or less the space where we can operate. But smaller towns, like even in the Far East, the picture is pretty much the same. The bigger the city, the more opposition to Putin. When you further go to the outback, Putin's support grows. Even in the Far East, Putin's support is strongest in the outback and weak in cities. What is happening is, it's not just Far East. What is happening is that over years, Putin has been losing support like forever, but from one region to another. We now have like a solid number of regions which essentially will never vote for Putin anymore. Like, it's not just Vladivostok or Khabarovsk, it's Irkutsk, with solid anti-Putin voting for like more than a decade now. They voted out the governor, the mayor, and stuff like that. Then they had direct elections abolished, and so Novosibirsk, they voted out incumbent mayor, and Putin support is fairly low. Arkhangelsk, with all that Putin has done to Arkhangelsk region, his support there is diminished like forever. Not even the defense industries which are concentrated there are helping. So Arkhangelsk votes like maybe 30% for United Russia maximum, right? So Putin's support there is the lowest. So not all regions are like that, but because of the region-specific situation, we have a lot of regions where Putin, for some reasons, have been fundamentally losing support, and it's not coming back. He's holding on because of like majority of other regions is like 50-50 situation there. And importantly, when we last had State Duma elections in 2016, there's been a record total percentage of votes for United Russia coming from what Dmitry Oreshkin calls electoral sultanates. These national republics, North Caucasus, Mordovia, Tiva, where they have like 99% turnout and 99% vote yes. So their total share exceeded 30% in the total votes for the first time ever, in the total votes received for United Russia in the Duma elections. So Putin is forced to actually get more and more votes from this handful of totally controlled republics to actually maintain his voting profile on the nationwide stage, because his support from all other regions is just not enough. So I don't know where he's going to get more from this, because I think the last drop has been squeezed already.
Say, how do you get more than 99.9% of the vote? Absolutely.
But actually, that's it's a classical stuff. If you remember Soviet referendum of '91, Soviet Communist Party get a lot of, also about a third of the votes from this national republic when you had this 99-99 situation. So that's an old tactic, but in the rest of the regions, popularity is systemically declining because of these factors I just explained.
Point taken. Very interesting. Yeah, I don't know how we can get out of that one. Right. I'm going to move back to capital flight, if I may, because you mentioned it earlier. Yeah. Question from Craig Oliphant at the Foreign Policy Centre. Picking up on your earlier references around capital outflows, he says, could you indeed say a bit more about capital flight from Russia? Obviously, a long-term challenge in the post-Soviet period, he says, particularly in the last 5 to 6 years. But in the context of sanctions, I suppose as well, could you say that capital flight figures have been going up? Is that correct? And would you characterize the effects, if any, from Putin's decree for the repatriation of funds of Russian elite wealth holders that are held abroad?
Now, listen, a major factor contributing to the capital flight is repaying of the old debt, because we have been borrowing like crazy. The private, not exactly the private sector, but the corporate and banking sector has been borrowing like crazy before financial sanctions introduced by the West in 2014, after we downed the Malaysian jet over Donbass. Before that, at the peak point, July 1st, 2014, total foreign debt portfolio of Russian companies and banks was 660 billion. It was up about 200 billion in just a few years. This is actually, so after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, this was a major driver of relative recovery. heavy international borrowing, like plus 200 billion bucks to the credit portfolio in just like 3 or 4 years, right? So we now repaying. This debt shrunk, I think, below 400 billion right now. We kept repaying that, so that's a major contribution to capital flight, because we have to. I mean, what the money that we make in Russia, we have to send abroad because we have to repay all these loans. That's a pretty important contribution. But also, I have to say what I meant. Capital flight is a bit down from previous years. I think the record capital flight was the year that Putin was re-elected for another 6-year term, 2018 plus the 2019. I think these were 2 years with the biggest capital flight. It's a bit down now, but I think it was $24 billion net capital flight in the first 4 months, if I'm not mistaken. It's something like that. You can check.
It's a bit down because it's all gone, I presume.
So when I'm talking to entrepreneurs, essentially what they say, the money that they still continue to make in Russia, they say it's nowhere to invest. We cannot. I mean, if there's an opening, if we want to buy some asset, we see that some state banks comes in and they say, no, we would buy this, you won't. So and what to like build new factory to sell your production to whom? Consumer demand is extremely depressed. There is no major feature of the recent crisis and the 6 consecutive years of stagnation and decline in real incomes is that demand is very weak. So to build new factory to sell stuff to whom, right? So this is actually why, plus all these risks of being arrested, your property expropriated, and all, which I've been talking about, the Titov report again, please read it. So when I talk to Russian entrepreneurs, they say, there is nowhere to invest. We can only move the money abroad. This is a major contributing factor. Apart from repaying the foreign debt, this is a major factor contributing to capital flight. What I actually said was that we have an uninterrupted years of capital flight since the last time we saw positive inflow of capital was the first half of 2008, 12 years ago.
Wow.
So 12 years of uninterrupted capital flight, net negative balance of capital flows, right? And a government is continuously predicting that capital flight will be zeroing out and eventually would turn into a positive territory. Remarkable. If you look each year when they adopt the federal budget, they accomplish it with supplementary note, пояснительная записка, right, where they provide a lot of scenarios for the future. Like each year, they say in like 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to turn positive in terms of capital flight reversing, and we're going to have an inflow, right? Not happening. It's just not happening because of all the stuff that I explained.
Understood. Very interesting. Thanks for the clarification. Listen, a final question, really quite a brief one perhaps, and that will finish us on time. It's from Mikhail Patashuri, and he asks this. At the end of the day, Vladimir, is economic policy in Russia ultimately deriving from the interests of a big monopoly state companies? Is that ultimately what it is, or is it more complex than that?
The short answer is yes, but the long answer is a bit more complex because, look, it's a symbiosis. You don't have to, you don't have to look at the Russian policy making as like there is a puppet Putin and some factors or interests which are driving what he's doing. It's a coexistence. It's a mutual coexistence. Putin has his vision. And in his vision is all about building this state-controlled national champions like we have, right? And then these national champions have their own interests, which fundamentally do not differ from that of Putin. So that's a pretty comfortable mutual coexistence because they both have their interests and they're doing the stuff that they love. So it's not like something is the primary driver of that. It's a symbiosis of both. So they both ride on each other's backs, and this is how it works.
Yeah, that's a much better and a more complex, but not overly complex, as some people do answer. I think that makes a lot of sense. Listen, I'm going to wrap it up there. That has been there's been so much content there, Vladimir. We will definitely make sure that this is seen and heard elsewhere by putting it on the website and sending it out to our stakeholders and to our wide variety of contacts. So thank you very much indeed. I said at the start, Vladimir, but we have a picture of you up on the wall at Chatham House. If I had my way, we'd have a statue, except that's not the done thing these days. I don't know, it might get knocked down. But frankly, Vladimir, I'm much indebted to you. You've been a long time being a friend of Chatham House, and hopefully you will continue to be so. And I see lots of claps going up on the electronic screen and the way they do these days. But thank you very much, everybody. Have a good week and goodbye.